The deep racism and bigotry of social justice. Hey, it's Prince of Queens, and recently I have been getting a lot of positive feedback regarding my sharing of anecdotal stories regarding specific topics related to the LGBT community and social justice proponents, so I figured I would share one about just how deeply bigoted social justice can make people. This story will mainly revolve around a certain individual that I have known for decades that honestly, very clearly has various psychological, pathological issues due to early childhood abuse. So I want people to be aware that there are very obvious reasons that this person was susceptible to this type of racist, man-hating indoctrination. This person is a mixed race person who is part Asian, whose father was white and extremely abusive to the guy I know when he was very little. His father was also abusive to various family members of his. I will not share the details, but they are very heavy. And these details of his abuse inspired me to give this person a lot of sympathy for a long time. With that in mind, this person ended up going to a certain specific Ivy League university where he was given a full scholarship based around a few social justice type credentials that he possessed, which I will not specify because I don't want to be explicitly obvious about who this person is. However, truthfully, due to many things, coupled with the fact that this person attended the Ivy League university for free for well over 4 years and allegedly finished all of his credits besides one course's worth, but for whatever reason wouldn't just finish that final course so that he could have his Ivy League degree. With all of that, I suspect something very strange was going on with his education. Honestly, as the years went on, I learned about more and more blatant lies that came from this former friend of mine, to the point where he could easily be a pathological liar, and I now suspect that he likely didn't even have half of the credits that he claimed to have, and maybe he took very few classes at the university. He might have only taken social justice classes, for all I know. You see, although I don't have any hard evidence of what I am about to say, I strongly suspect that this Ivy League university had likely grown to be an early testing ground for social justice indoctrination, in particular regarding the courses of study that this person focused on while they were there. This person studied international relations due to the fact that he had done a fair amount of anti-war activism type stuff prior to being accepted to the university. And one thing that you should know about me is that, due to personal reasons, I deliberately avoided thinking about politics deeply from about 2005 all the way up through 2014 or so, almost entirely, for complicated reasons. That said, while I personally didn't like to delve much into politics as an individual, I did know several people that considered themselves political activists of various varieties, whom I would do artistic projects and organize shows with, some of whom defined as anarchists, some were Marxists, all were leftists. We would throw events that were united by the theme of being queer, for example, which I thought was cool because I was gay, and it was fun to work with various people who were all basically a bunch of freaks that did weird performances and stuff. With this individual, however, that went to the Ivy League University, I specifically did a lot of anti-war type stuff, naively assuming that he had a good message and that we were doing something that was ultimately serving a good purpose. But I realize now that it kinda didn't, as he is a deeply twisted bigot. I had gotten bits and pieces of this from him over the years, as I had known him for literally decades. When he was young, he once told me that Asian people don't actually have yellow skin like the stereotype claims, but rather it's that they work in the sun a lot, so they are more tan. I didn't think much of it at the time, and maybe at the time it didn't mean all that much. He did always, however, seem to resent me for being white, though. Later, at a certain point a few years ago, we talked about World War II, and this is where I started to realize that something was deeply wrong with my friend. When we talked about the ending of the war and why the bomb was dropped on Japan, he said that it was because of racism. According to him, we dropped the bomb on the Japanese and not on Hitler because they were Asian, and we didn't want to bomb white people. I was taken aback because I by no means considered myself a history buff, and my friend had studied international relations at an Ivy League university. So I figured he was supposed to at least have a slight clue about what he was talking about, but, seriously? I know that we were racist against the Japanese during the war, sure, but there was a bit more to it. I could have sworn that I remembered that we dropped the bomb on the Japanese largely because they had bombed Pearl Harbor, sinking aircraft carriers, which was something that we didn't even think that they had the technology to be able to do. I could have sworn that the Japanese were attempting to take over Hawaii, which is in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, which would have given them the ability to attack the mainland of the United States, which made them an immediate threat to our nation, whereas the Germans had done nothing of the sort. I said this to my friend, and he changed the subject. He said, "No, it was just racism. I mean, if we wanted to end the war, we could have dropped the bomb on Hitler, and the Japanese would have known not to mess with us anymore." Or something. It blew me away. How could anybody be this delusional? From then on, I was more suspicious of him, and I started paying more careful attention to certain things that he said, or that he typed on Facebook. One of the things that came out, which I believe he must have learned in his social justice university courses, was basically an extrapolated version of what is commonly referred to as colorism. The simple notion, as it was coined by Alice Walker, who wrote the book The Color Purple, is that colorism is the specific term for when black people discriminate against other black people for being darker or lighter skinned than each other. But what I learned through this person is that people have taken it quite a lot further than that. At one point in conversation, he went on to explain that white people, in his estimation, aren't necessarily simply Europeans, but rather the pale people of any society that have been trained to escape working in the sun, presumably because they were ordering everybody else around, and thus genetically they grew to be pale. Thus, from his vantage point, there are light Asians and dark Asians, and I guess according to him, the light Asians oppress the dark Asians, and basically all of society is set up as a system in this way. A system of which he is fundamentally opposed to, as his Asian lineage is not Japanese or Chinese, but one of the generally more dark nations. He also believes that we live in a white male patriarchy, of course. He knows pretty much nothing about contemporary politics, but he knew that he didn't want Trump to win because he's a white male, of course. And at least Hillary Clinton was a female. This is a guy who is gay that also thinks that all homophobia is rooted in misogyny as well. When I brought up the notion of ways in which homosexuals are feared to be pedophiles and how that isn't misogyny, he changed the subject, similar to the way in which he changed the subject when I was talking about Pearl Harbor. I don't think it's simply that he doesn't want to contemplate certain arguments. I honestly think that he basically is incapable of seeing reality for what it is. Finally, the worst thing about this guy, from my perspective, who again had an extremely abusive childhood with an extremely abusive white male father, the worst thing about this guy is that he projects all of his own racism and misandry onto me, and seems to believe that he knows how I think and why I think the way I do. And of course, it's mostly because I'm a white male. When I started questioning the left heavily and openly a few years ago, due to obvious reasons that I don't feel compelled to explain to my audience, he not only told me that I was in the wrong to do so, but he told me that he knew why I was doing it. He said that he understood the lens I saw the world through. He said it had something to do with my father, which obviously, if you are familiar with my channel, couldn't be further from the truth, because when do I ever talk about my father? Though, of course, he talks about his father constantly. I tried repeatedly to explain my perspective to him, but he not only wouldn't listen, he also dismissed it. I had known this guy for over 20 years, and he was literally telling me, I know why you think the way that you do, and you're wrong. I'm not interested in allowing you to explain yourself, though. I can only guess his feelings were based entirely around the fact that I'm a white male. It was at this point where I realized that I could not be friends with him anymore, and I disowned him as a friend. And honestly, I don't think he will be able to regain my friendship, even though we know each other for forever. It took me a very long time, but I finally learned from this final straw, not only that this is a deeply damaged person that has severe psychological issues, who honestly never had any real friends besides myself and his sister. If he was even my real friend, honestly, he never really did anything remotely self-sacrificing or anything like a friend would, and I did for him over and over. But much more so, he is a deeply, probably irreconcilably bigoted person, more than likely inspired initially by his resentment towards his father, but eventually pushed into an entire hateful worldview by way of social justice indoctrination, which led him to see the entire world through a hateful lens. And of course, the ironic thing is that, in spite of all his hatred towards white men, he's only ever dated white men. And he was always kind of rather obsessed with me in an unhealthy way. But I'd rather not really get into that. That's all I have to say for this video. Stay tuned.